Welcome to Eve's Creative Laboratory. I'm Eve. In this video, I'm going to compare and contrast the way I pieced each top using the same block pattern, but choosing different values of fabrics for the different areas of each block. So they turned out a little bit different, but it's the same pattern. When I sandwiched both of these quilts, I was using scrap fabric for the backing. And for this quilt, I barely had enough. I only have about maybe ½ inch to an inch. Because I didn't have enough of this type of fabric for the entire backing, I pieced stripes of the extra fabric that I didn't use for the quilt top. For this quilt, I used a minky fabric on the back. This was some extra backing that I had from a quilt that I made for my friend's son. And so this minky fabric actually is a little bit hard to work with because it doesn't stick very well to the batting when I sandwiched it. I did baste it with pins, but it still moves around a lot. So this might be challenging to quilt. And I'm planning on quilting both of these in part 3 of this video series. After I finished piecing the top of this quilt, I realized that I didn't quite have enough of this fabric to make the first border all the way around the quilt. So I needed to supplement with something. And so I had extra half-square triangles from the 2 baby quilts that I previously made with this fabric. So I think I'm gonna put those in the corners, kind of like a cornerstone. I had 4 triangles out of the brown, so that might make a nice kind of frame. It reminds me of those old photograph tabs in a scrapbook, so that might look interesting. So I am planning on making a light binding or medium tone binding around the edge of this after I sew this border on. But I'm gonna have to piece it carefully because like this one doesn't quite make it around, and then this one right here is a little bit longer. So I think I'll be able to connect all of them once I sew these corner areas together. So this is the first border that I've had to piece, so I'm gonna see how that turns out. I like the way the quilt top turned out. And I really do like those brown triangles in the corners. But something that I learned from this pattern is that I used dark colors in the center of these 3 pieces. And if I use a dark in the very edge, I'll get a windmill pattern here. And that doesn't really show up in the quilt because the windmill pattern that I got is made out of light squares. So I think in my next one, I'm gonna do another version of this, and I'm gonna use dark, the darkest ones in this, this area here, instead of where I used it in the center here. In the previous video, my main goal was to use my scraps up, so I wasn't paying attention to which color went where in the block. But I discovered, and many of you probably already know this, but I discovered that it really does matter the placement of the color or value of your fabric to draw out those secondary patterns. So I decided to make another quilt top using more of my scraps, but this time I'm going to use yellow to highlight a secondary pattern, which is the little windmill shapes in the corners. For this quilt top, I had more of the blue and gray fabric than the yellow. So I chose to put the yellow in this area because that was really all I had. I barely had enough for that. And then I had a few strips of the gray fabrics left over from cutting these squares. And the biggest border that I could make from all the leftovers was 3 inches. I got 6 7-inch strips that were 3 inches wide from the strips that were left over of the gray fabric. And I sewed all of those together end to end to go all the way around the border. And I barely had enough. This was all I had left of that, just one 7-inch piece and this little strip at the end. So I'm glad that I used up all of that.